I don't know if you managed to go to it. I realised that I've not synchronized my emails yet.
Does everyone like my background today?
It's lovely. There we are.
Competition in our seminar group to see who can have the most Larry background.
I've gone with the boring, but I could change that. I think there's certainly on Zoom you can get sunglasses which actually go over your face. So I've thought about presenting in that, but
maybe the one where you can be a potato. Have you seen that?
I've not seen that one yet. No.
It'd be very hard to take you seriously if you're.
It's quite difficult anyway, but
I think hopefully people are gradually making their way to the right place after they finish their seminars. But do you want to share your slides, Simon?
Yes, let's try this.
Working and then.
How's that look?
Yep, that looks good.
Okay, that's good. You become quite small down there. That'll do though, that's fine. Right, I mean, I don't know. Do you want me to dive right in and we wait for maybe 5 more minutes or so?
Maybe just give it a couple of minutes till 10 past because it was straight off the back of the seminars. But then feel free to kick off and introduce yourself, of course, because there'll be some students that haven't met you yet.
Yes, that's true. So I'll get to introduce myself. Sorry for missing this morning, by the way. I've got my, I'm synchronized now. So I've got my MMU. Reminders are set. That was a big panic moment. And I've found the new brief with the new times on. So yeah, I think
great.
I should be all there now. Great. I don't know if I missed anything of importance or.
Everything was ended up being in that email anyway, so don't worry. I'm going to chat to David if you want. If you haven't written else.
Okay.
So how are we doing? I'm just going to duck out myself, try and check if people are loitering in the wrong Teams spaces. So please excuse me and just, feel free to start when you're ready and I'll try and redirect more people to the right place.
Okay, I'll make a start in 5 minutes, shall I? 1:15. How's thesis writing, David?
I'm going to try to do some tonight, so that's the best I can say at the moment.
Yeah, mine's taking a back foot at the moment.
Yeah,
just with various other responsibilities. Okay, I think we'll make a start. There's still people dropping in, so hello to all of you. You see we're up to 59 now. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Simon. I'm in group 1 with David, and I'm just going to be presenting a little bit of my research today. I hope it's somehow catered towards an understanding on the urbanism and architecture course. Of course, I come from a slightly different background. I'm looking predominantly at conservation and heritage, but there's other parts to that which interest me as well, related to kind of architectural history, the way we historicize our famous projects, and importantly, the historiography of that, the way that that history / heritage is constructed. So that's the title of my thesis so far, which I will unpack a little bit later on, revisiting Bauhaus architectural heritage, logics of valuation through collecting, archiving, and exhibiting. That might sound a little bit all over the place and alien at the moment, but I will explain that in due course. So a little bit about me. So as I say, I'm in the 4th year of my PhD now at the University of Manchester, and I came through Manchester. I started in 2011, 3 years to do my BA. I then took 2 years out, working in various places, various countries, before coming back to complete my master's, and then deciding to take on a PhD, which is where I am today. There's a few practices I've included there from that experience, in professional experiences. A practice in Norway who were focused on creating bird hides of all things. Really interesting kind of project, and kind of architecturally really interesting as well, because not only were they interested in creating these bird hides, it was in like a very rural part of the north of Norway, so they were interested also in this kind of destination development, tourism, etc. And then another practice in Nepal I worked at who used natural building materials to produce earthquake resistant homes, and they were also interested in that kind of circular economy around design, which was super interesting. So they kind of employed bamboo plantations and farms, and they quarried all their kind of materials on site. So a couple of interesting practices out there, and a little bit of a backdrop of what I did prior to my PhD. Now onto the PhD. As I say, it's related to the Bauhaus, quite a famous institution in Germany, specifically the foundation in Dessau. And getting there was not such a sort of obvious or formative choice. In fact, I attended a research lab, a summer project in 2019. I think this is a really important point to make in general about how research emerges, which is that often, there's opportunities present themselves, and your research, your theses and your dissertations will inevitably change based on the kind of opportunities that are presented. You'll potentially follow certain leads, and through that kind of a research project can begin to emerge. So I was there for 3 months. I worked in a lab with 7 others. They were architects, designers, historians, PhD students, among others. And we produced an exhibition and a publication on a table designed by the famous Bauhauser Marcel Breuer. It was related to his trajectory, if you like, or migration to London, as a lot of Bauhausers were exiled before the Second World War. And it was really about kind of looking for and tracing these kind of traces and chains of design, which eventually became a kind of global phenomenon. So really looking at the way that our kind of designly ways are interrelated, and not necessarily the Bauhaus existed solely in Germany, but kind of had repercussions right through to, you see in the bottom left there, a table produced by a London-based company based on patents from the original Breuer table designed in Germany. But as I say, this led to my eventual PhD, which the title I'll come back to. But given that I was in a new site, in a new location, among a foundation institution with various people who we might call gatekeepers, you know, when you are allowed into such an institution, when you are kind of granted a little bit of access, and that's wherever, it's really good to maintain and hold and perhaps nurture these relationships, because good research can come from that. I'm going to frame today's on my methods, because methods is such an important part of your own research, and you've been looking at that a number of times in previous weeks and even today. I use ethnography, which some of you will be familiar with already. For those who aren't as sure, it kind of derived from anthropology and kind of methods in studying cultures, tribes of people. My tribe is the Bauhaus Institute in Dessau. And I'm going to show you how my ethnographic methods, such as semi-structured interviews, site observations, documenting, and just photographing, and just really trying to describe the scene that I'm working in, how that helps to inform my research. And hopefully I'll show you how ethnography can bring us closer to the daily workings of an institution. And that's a really important point. And that's where the value of ethnography lies, really, is that it allows us to see the kind of things that really go on in an institution, or, for example, you've been looking through the kind of urban landscape, the types of things which go on. And the reading by Amin and Thrift really touched upon a good point, where he talked about the city as a source rather than a cause. And I think ethnographic research really sits within that kind of idea, that the places, the context where we develop our research, they become the source. The people that we observe and we look at, they are the experts, and it's up to us to try and understand, to try and flesh out the kind of practices that really go on, because it's not necessarily what we might read about or how they might even present themselves. So back to my title. I've highlighted there the words heritage, obviously, and this might be interesting for some of you on the surface level who are interested in heritage and city planning. And then also valuation. So the two are very interrelated. You know, heritage is in a sense ascribed a certain value. It's given a value judgment, and often a series of laws and legislations and protections and even cultures emerge from that. Now, we're going to look at that a little bit more in more detail and how ethnography sits within that. But it's through the daily practices that I'm interested in looking at. In this case, we will see the types of conservation work that goes on there, which is related to this idea of collecting, that's collecting objects, their subsequent archiving, and even exhibiting. That will make sense as we move on, but keep heritage and value in mind. So yeah, heritage. The Bauhaus is a heritage institution. Many of you will know about it. It's very famous. It's considered sort of the origin of modern architecture and modern design. It's been officially UNESCO since the turn of the century. However, in the 100 years since it's existed, it's had kind of conservation protection since at least the 60s. It's not always been sort of straightforward, and there are various different institutional levels of protection, right down from the state through to and the local sort of city administration, through to the kind of highest authority being UNESCO, which recognizes this institution as something worthy of protecting based on its history as the origin of modern architecture. Really interesting aspect, though, of this kind of heritagization, if you like, is the type of value that is ascribed to it. So when we think of heritage, when we think of conservation in this case, there are a number of various sort of criteria which a institution like UNESCO works towards in defining why it's valuable. And this is where the kind of muckiness, if you like, starts to emerge. This is where the contradictions start to emerge. And the words you might be familiar with on how you might define something as being of kind of heritage significance is words like integrity, originality, authenticity. And some of you will be aware of this in the cities where you live, where there's protected monuments or protected sites. And one of the things they try to preserve and conserve is the spirit of the place. It's that authentic value. People come here because they want to see a window into the past. They want a material historic testimony, which kind of historicizes their nation, perhaps. It grounds them. It helps frame the view of where they've come from and perhaps where they're going. But this is really interesting with regard to kind of modern heritage especially. And this is certainly the kind of specifics of what I'm going to be discussing, because a lot of traditional heritage is kind of somehow sort of accepted within its ruins. You know, the kind of the change that's allowed to happen to these buildings, their patina of age, if you like. This is all accepted as a part of its authenticity. But modern buildings have a different history. They have a different kind of intention, if you like. They came at the kind of narratives that come with them on the back of the Second World War especially, is this idea that they're breaking from the past, that they are kind of involved in the new. You know, they are up to date and fresh. They should exist through their functionalism. They should continue to work. These are their intentions. But things change. You know, political systems change, technologies change, our values change, our working routines change. The Bauhaus School has changed a lot in the 100 years that it's existed. It's survived various political regimes, it's survived Nazism, and it's also had a series of transformations in the GDR times, that's East Germany, when there was the break of the war during the Cold War. And it's been demolished and it's been rebuilt. And a lot of conversations around modern architecture especially might resolve around these inscribed values that we're used to seeing through UNESCO. So we get a lot of unhelpful questions around, can the Bauhaus truly be authentic when it's been demolished and rebuilt, when it's survived various political systems which have introduced their own kind of adaptations? We have various modifications from the Soviet period. We have original materials from the 20s. Someone would argue, many people would argue, in fact, that it's not authentic, that these materials, these embodied materials, are no longer, they're kind of an imitation of what was there prior. And this is where ethnography really comes into the fore, because we want to challenge those existing categories, those existing assumptions about why it's valuable and for what reasons it's valuable. And in the same sense, I think about this kind of stuff you've been reading and learning about in relation to, for example, the categories of urbanism and what defines a city, and the kind of homogeneous sort of assumptions about this is a city or this is rural. When we get down to the ground, in fact, we see it's not so clear cut and clean cut as that. In fact, there's mixtures, there's complexities, there's pluralities, there's difference. And ethnography, I hope, begins to shine a light on that. These systems still work somehow within these kind of contradictions, that there's not necessarily a kind of unifying set of principles to work to. So I use ethnographic methods in order to explore assumptions about the inheritance, the inherent or objective value of the Bauhaus. That's the belief that these heritage objects, if you like, whether the Bauhaus or all others, have some kind of transcendent value, that they have always been valuable, that it's embodied within it, that wherever you put it in the world, it would remain valuable. And yeah, so that's this idea that it's always been esteemed and it's always existed as something to protect. And today, in the conservation charters that protect the institution, I'm going to very briefly explore through my own observations and interviews, so that's the ethnographic work, how Bauhaus architectural heritage value is socially constructed. That is, instead, to say the process by which it becomes valuable. So my position, if you like, is that the Bauhaus doesn't necessarily have an inherent value. Rather, its value has emerged based on a series of social contingencies, be it political, cultural, but economic as well. We'll begin to see the way that, in fact, it remains valuable because it's attached to a series of other kind of actors, if you like, which allow it to maintain that value. So into the ethnographic work. And it starts with the opening of a new Bauhaus Museum to celebrate the centenary of the Bauhaus in 2019. And some of you might recognize a very important figure in Germany and even internationally within that photo. Bearing in mind the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation. Dessau is a very small, quite lowly city. It has economic issues. It has issues with aging population. There is a kind of conflict existing between the Bauhaus and other parts of the city who kind of feel alienated or detached from this global institution. It's unusual for someone like Chancellor Angela Merkel to kind of descend on this city, but to celebrate 100 years, they opened a new museum, which you just see in the background there. So it was a huge event and it attracted global media attention. So this kind of initial point is just how kind of valuable the Bauhaus must be. It can attract the most powerful office in Germany to come and to visit, to see, and to inaugurate the Bauhaus institution, to validate it. So while I was living there, I lived in a small apartment block, or sorry, a rather large apartment block on the top floor. And this just gives you a little bit of an example of the kind of activities and heightened security that was happening on that day. The streets were lined. There was, you can see in the top left, you can see security were taking high positions. You knew that, you know, if you look at this as a kind of a culture of people, that this is something very serious, something very important going on. Obviously, these objects within inside the museum must be incredibly important. They must tell a story. And you see, this is inside the museum now. A lot of objects you would expect to find within the canon of heritage discourse. Things you would expect to associate with the Bauhaus, artwork, furniture, costumes, kitchenware. There was architectural drawings as well and models. Things we understand to be valuable, things when we go to a museum we won't question. We're expecting to see them. They are a part of that kind of consumption of heritage, if you like. But there were some other interesting objects there, slightly more contested ones. There was a breeze block. Now, I don't have the actual photo of this, and unfortunately, my ethnographic work was interrupted due to the pandemic. But this is from that exhibition category, and it's a block work, and it's sat next to one of the chairs, and alongside a architectural model. And it's kind of, unusual to see a piece of block in an exhibition. It doesn't have the kind of profile as a well-designed chair or a crafted textile. And it caused a lot of upset and controversy among art historians who were on the tour. In fact, I spoke to one of the curators of the exhibition, who is also the head of collection at the Bauhaus, to ask him, why was this here, and what was it doing in a museum? It wasn't an artwork. It wasn't related to some kind of architectural design process. And he was insistent. He said, no, it's designed. This block work was produced innumerably all over Dessau. It helped with the construction of the Turton settlement, which we'll see in a moment, but also in the construction of the Bauhaus building. It's an incredibly important feature to the Bauhaus's architectural history. Now, he said a lot of art historians refused to believe that. They refused to believe it should be considered as something exhibited, something to be sort of valorized, if you like, or publicized, something for the public, because it's mundane, it's boring, it's hidden, it's multiple. It's not an original in the sense that it wasn't crafted by an artist or a designer who spent time thinking over its kind of uniqueness. Instead, it's just a kind of simple and very humble breeze block. And as I said, it was integral to the production of the Turton settlement, which is a really important aspect of my research. The Turton settlement is a town in Dessau that was built during the time of Walter Gropius, the founder of the Bauhaus. And it was very much in the mold of this idea of modern living, these new ways of living. It is a housing estate, I should say, which was constructed with new materials like concrete, steel and glass, the classic, but also with bigger gardens, wider roads, and in some cases driveways as well. So it was a very kind of modern, at the time, way of living, and a proposal for how we could live. And it still exists. It still operates today, does this settlement. However, it's owned by private residents. So in the last 100 years, it's undergone all sorts of changes. People who want to make changes to their homes, they don't necessarily see their private homes as a Bauhaus object with special heritage importance. No, they just see their home as their home, and they want to make it their home. They want to make the changes and adaptations to their home, which most of us who will own a home might wish to do over their lifetime. So with that in mind, it's really important to remember this Turton settlement and the opening of this new museum, because at the same time as the opening of the new museum, another much smaller exhibition opened. And this one was in the basement of the Bauhaus building, and it was an exhibition on building materials. So in relation to the Bauhaus's heritage kind of status and its conservation, about 20 years ago now, at the turn of the century, a number of people at the institution decided that they need to preserve this building, and the way to do it is through the collection of building materials. So in the 20 years since, they have collected a series of various Bauhaus building materials and archived it in order that they can continue the work of preservation science and conservation and restoration. So you see, within this exhibition, which was much smaller and a lot less celebrated, it was a different kind of materiality on show. It was related to the works of building research, their science, if you like, and the types of methods that undergo in validating kind of original heritage. How do you make sure that these buildings maintain an original historic testimony to the past is what kind of drives their thinking. Now, in the top right picture there, you see a box, and if you can't make it out, it's a fragmented door handle. And it's a really interesting story behind that. According to the founder of the Building Material Archive, it is a Walter Gropius door handle. And for her, this is the origin of the archive. It was found, she said, in the basement of the Bauhaus whilst they were undergoing reconstruction in the late 90s. And she described it as being found, she found it in between two mounds of rubbish. So that, I think, is a really interesting point here. She was able to identify, as an expert and an architect and a historian, she was able to identify this door handle, and she ascribed a value judgment to it. She defined it as being in between two mounds of rubbish, whereas others of the past won't have noticed that. They will have just considered it rubbish. So she collected it, and she put it through the archive and redescribed it and identified it. And there's other examples here as well. You have on the left-hand side a formwork to create a glass breeze block. Now, this is something they've created themselves, and it's in order that people from the Teuton settlement might reproduce or restore part of the original features. And in the bottom photograph, we see just on the right-hand side a piece of floor. It's a concrete wood screed, and also all the constituent elements of that in a petri dish. So we start to see that a part of their process of validating, of creating original, they have to break down these objects into their constituent parts, really begin to understand the specific kind of materials that go into it, and work to create that and to validate, and in a way begin to add value and proof to the materials that exist. If we move away from the exhibition, we'll come back to that in a second. The archive is located about 2 kilometers away from the institution, in an old brewery conveniently called the Bauhaus. It's got a really interesting history in itself. It's today politically contentious. The owners want to sell it for €1. There's various kind of activities and various usages happening within that building. Next door to the archive, which you can see there in the bottom left-hand corner and the top left, you have a climbing wall, for example. But this building is really interesting in itself. It's a space which is convenient, albeit it's not ideal. But for the last 20 years, it has become a place which is fairly local and affordable to storing the various materials that they have in store. So here we begin to see what the collected objects look like. We have radiators there, there is stairs, there's a concrete well, there's floor slabs. And this is just a snapshot into the 20 years of work that has gone, 20 years of practice that has gone into a way helping them with their restoration work and their conservation work. You can see as well, they begin to organize and they begin to categorize and put into various groups the types of objects that they collect. that are somehow all Bauhaus related, either directly original or mass-produced items which are found in the Bauhaus. But for me, within this process, within this practice, there is a kind of evaluation emerging through the very work of identifying, organizing, putting into place. They are making real the value of the Bauhaus. It's no longer simply a case of in these classification systems that we might find at UNESCO. We see a different kind of classification system, which is broken down into much smaller parts. Yet it's through that work, through that practice, and that repetition, that the value begins to become something concrete. And within the archive, you begin to see various relations that you might not typically associate with a protected original heritage institution. So the person who took me around the archive that day was able to point at various objects, ones which just sort of was stood in front of us, or ones he found interesting. In this case, a radiator, which he pointed out, and again, it's a very boring, kind of mundane radiator, but it's also really interesting in the sense that it wasn't a Bauhaus original. In fact, it was the same kind of radiator used in the Bauhaus, but found in a local kindergarten, which was undergoing refurbishment. Now, the person taking me around there, Martin, has worked at the Bauhaus for 15 years, and he's been working with the archive, collecting objects all that time. He's also from Dessau, and this is a really important point, because it means that over the time that he's been working, he's built relationships. He's built informal relationships. And I know today we looked a little bit at one of the texts related to urban informalities. And there's a really interesting point in that about how when we start to, go onto the ground and see what's actually unfolding, we can start to see those informalities that aren't necessarily recorded in the kind of the strict guidelines or the strict regimes at a higher level. In fact, this radiator that would contribute to the kind of overall conservation and preservation of the Bauhaus was found because he was friends with this kindergarten boss, if you like, who knew that Martin was interested in Bauhaus materials. So he called him one day and said, well, I'm making change. Perhaps there's something down here you can identify. Perhaps there's something which is important for the archive. And we begin to see in other cases then that this kind of idea of an original, in this case, the Bauhaus, something which is almost pure and separate and fixed and is designed with very specific kind of materials. In fact, when you're in the archive, you can see the number of mundane materials is incredibly local and interrelated with all sorts of ordinary buildings. The window we see on the left is from an apartment building that was in Martin's apartment, a neighbor of his who wanted to create a balcony with a door. And this window in a very typical, very ordinary apartment building was the exact same as the building we see on the right, the Kornhaus, which is a famous monumental Bauhaus building in Dessau. So yeah, on the ground, these kind of these special buildings which are of heritage value, which we might say have a kind of aura, sort of sacredness and holiness. In fact, when you're in the archive, you see the they're broken down and made in such ordinary and mundane and common materials. There's another really interesting kind of I would say value in ethnographic work is the possibility for serendipity. That's chance. So the chance encounters which might emerge if you are able to go and visit someone for an interview, for example, or go and visit a site with an expert or someone we might call a gatekeeper, someone with serious knowledge of the subject you're interested in learning about. And my chance encounter came during my visit to the archive with Martin when the telephone rang, and he answered the phone, and he was on the phone for maybe 30 minutes or so. And when he finished on the phone, he told me that he'd just been speaking to a friend at the City Planning Authority. They've known each other for as long as he's worked there, for 15 years. And he says in that time they built up an informal relationship, a kind of casual relationship. The City Planning Authority is 2 people, and they are in charge of all the kind of adaptations and changes that happen to a person's home or building, whether it's a resident or office, for example. They must, like very common, very typical of every country, go through a planning authority. And in the mid-90s, when we think back to the Turton settlement, which you can see in a guideline on the right-hand side, they produced in '94 a small conservation guideline. It does have some kind of legal level. For example, you can't make wholesale changes to the outside of your house. You can't add like huge solar power panels or a ground source heat pump or something like that. It's just a big clunky technology to the outside. You have to use particular paint, so you can't color it too much. Anyway, they produced this guideline in tandem, the council, in tandem with the Bauhaus and people from the building and construction department there. These are the people that work at the archive. And they built a kind of informal relationship there. And ever since then, people at the Turton settlement, whenever they've made changes to their home, adaptations like people want to make, perhaps they want to change the size of their rooms, or perhaps they want to add an extension out the back. They want to, it could be various changes. Either way, they have to go through the planning authority. And this is a moment, if you like, a kind of formalized moment which becomes informal when they decide, the planning authority, when they look at it, this person wants to replace a staircase. Perhaps the Bauhaus will be interested in collecting that. I'll give them a call. And this is exactly what's happened. And a number of various objects that they have collected and saved have been built through these informal relationships. So it's interesting then to see, on the ground, the kind of ideas of integrity and originality make way for other kind of values, which can't necessarily be defined through fixed categories. In this case, simple relationships, working closely with planning authorities, even having a presence down at the Turton settlement, where a number of neighbours in recent years have become interested. They've learnt about the potential value of the homes that they're living in, and now they're also on the phone to Martin, who we see here, to say, oh, there's a skip outside a house, and it looks like someone might be making changes. Perhaps you want to come down. So you see how a kind of a group of people starts to emerge, which helps to sort of maintain and sustain, but also to disseminate, to spread knowledge about the importance of of the Bauhaus. So as I say, I was lucky to be there, and a telephone call came through, and there was an immediate kind of pressing sort of potential object to be collected, which was a staircase from a home. So we went down, we identified it. It was decided that it was of value. They had one already, but they could do with a second one because this one's in a slightly better condition. But as I say, these are people's homes, and they're not necessarily bothered or interested about the kind of sacredness of the Bauhaus, its kind of heritage value. Instead, as Martin tells me, that's the archivist, that the homeowner, he says, they're just totally stupid, totally unhistoric. They don't really value these objects the way we do. So it's really interesting there, this idea that in fact, much of this continued practice emerges from people's ordinary living experiences. In this case, people want to make changes. It's through there that the potential for heritage starts to emerge, through, in this case, a collection of an object. And they knew it was valuable, they knew it was important. This image on the right is taken from a historical book from the mid-90s, in which a historian on the Turton settlement kind of took photos and kind of produced all the typologies of the various types of houses there. In this case, it's not the exact staircase, but it's the same kind. So there's a connection there for these experts to say, well, this is the case study. This is the physical. Nothing is better than having the physical. The book is helpful, but now we can make a connection. We can actually collect this object, and we can bring it back to the archive where it can be saved and protected. So various members of a team, if you like, came together. Which is really, as well, another interesting aspect of this. You know, when you're on the ground, you don't necessarily have the resources, or as they say, the manpower, you know, the various people to come together to collect these objects. You would think that something chartered as high as UNESCO would have ordinary systems in place for this kind of thing, but this is a completely uncharted practice, and they don't make space for it to happen. They have to put together people last minute. The bottom left, we see a student intern helping out. In the top left and on the top right, we see a caretaker. It's a motley crew. It's a group of interested individuals who might have time off, or they might be students educated, or they might be experts who believe they have a kind of obligation towards these materials. As gatekeepers, they feel that it's their duty, their moral responsibility. So they don't necessarily get paid for this per se, but it's a part of their practice and who they are. And then, of course, that staircase is disassembled, it's transported, and it's brought to the archive to be reassembled. So the really interesting aspect of this is through the ethnographic work, you follow, in this case, I've followed the trajectory of this staircase. We've traced it from its use value, hidden behind a private residence home where it's lived silently for the past 100 years. It's now suddenly decoupled, alienated, if you like, and taken away from that home, disassembled, physically sort of made unrecognizable, transported, and then brought back to be reassembled. And it's through this process, I would argue, that its existence, its new existence as an object of heritage value begins to emerge. And this goes back to that question of these assumptions that objects such as the Bauhaus, heritage objects, were always valuable. They were always had this inheritance of value. No, instead, we can see quite literally here that homeowners don't see the value in this staircase. They want a new staircase. This old one's rickety, it's bulky. They throw it out. They don't care about it. Those who sort of know about it kind of build a group emerges around it of interested people, and they take it and they reassemble it. And within that technique and that practice, its new existence begins to emerge. It is no longer a private staircase in a resident, but it's an object of history, of historical inquiry, of potential exhibition futures, of potential science and research. It starts to develop a kind of multiplicity. And we can see that even in this photo on the bottom right-hand corner there. One of the caretakers who was brought to help reassemble, he gave one of the students there, the one in the top left you see at the back, a small kind of heart attack. He was very anxious of the way they were treating this object when they were reassembling it. He was saying, oh, they just don't understand the importance of it. They're scratching away the paint, they're bending it, they've been banging it. And so you begin to see then within these kind of mediators, which is another word that we've been discussing in recent weeks, these objects which become points of potential controversy or political contention, we already begin to see that different people view an object in a different way. We've had the private residents who it was a staircase. You have the student here who's already thinking about it through this kind of architectural history and heritage perspective as being sort of a precious object that could be exhibited. And you have the caretaker who treats it as a purely technical object, something to be achieved, something to be reassembled. And often you need this variety of people in an assemblage. In this case, the staircase was so old, it was just so resistant to the kind of modern tools that they used to try and reassemble it. So it had to be kicked, it had to be clanged, it had to be booted together. You know, this is the kind of resistance that it was having towards its reassembly. It's a staircase that works through tension, so it's difficult, frankly, to assemble. And then when it's assembled in the archive, in the storeroom, it's assigned a label, and that label is on it is a number is drawn, and that number goes on to a continuous number roll, an indiscriminate number roll of all new objects that come in. They get the next number in the line. And for at least the chief archivist who I spoke to, it becomes valuable as soon as it has a number. For them, this is this moment in which it's now a part of the archive. It's something that it wasn't before. Before it was a mundane object living in someone's home, just fulfilling its original function. Now it's become an archival object. It's become something of possibility, a moment in time in which they can not only look after this object and store it away, but think about its potential future uses, whether it end up in an exhibition or whether it become important for conservation science. This object has now kind of got this new identity. It's changed. And that goes through a process of digitization. This is the kind of archival description, and this is the process of archiving. We've seen the collecting. We now moved on to kind of its archival existence. So how does it become an archival object? How does it start to become an object of heritage significance? Well, in this case, you see that it's redescribed. It enters a new world of relations based on descriptions on typology, on date, on number, on materiality, on size. All these definitions, these new definitions that are given to it, are what helps to define its new character. So it becomes, in a way, attached to these new value systems, these new necessary kind of descriptions that are required for allowing it to be and become something of heritage value. So it's just a little recap there on how these objects become valuable. Their value is known by a small number of experts who are aware of the history and significance of the objects they collect. Over time, others, such as the planning authority, but even neighbours on the street, become aware of the work of the Bauhaus Building Research Archive and assist in the identification of objects, which can lead to their recognition. The objects are then decoupled from their former lives and reconstituted within the walls of the archival space among new neighbours, each with a new identity related to their architectural history. A network between these building materials and their caregivers emerges. I say that's human and non-human, is formed in which our ideas of Bauhaus architectural heritage value emerges. So it's this idea that based on kind of social groupings, and as I said earlier about how this value is socially constructed, these objects in a way become implicated. They become attached to a new world, a new network that exists not only the humans, that's the caregivers, the archivists, the collectors, those who describe the object, but the non-humans, that's the objects that they exist alongside. You know, when these objects are repeated and copied and collected and organized between bathtubs and staircases and radiators, that kind of level of organization is giving value. It's generating some kind of understanding. And without that, you know, the kind of conservation strategies wouldn't necessarily work. So onto that exhibition, this small exhibition that we saw a little bit at the start, which is related to building materials, these objects which are not necessarily considered canon of Bauhaus art and architecture history. That's the main exhibition that we saw, which had paintings and artworks and architectural models and things we would expect to see. Here we see a smaller exhibition, a much smaller, with much less kind of publicity, if you like, of different objects, of mundane objects, of kind of research objects, if you like, related to building and conservation research. Of course, you know, there's conditions. The staircase was too big for the exhibition, but there's things like, for example, this window. And you can start to see the way that it's been treated now, and that it's has to be leaned in a particular way to get through the door, to get in. So there's all kinds of conditions which sort of shape potential objects to be not only curated but exhibited. And that can be even a spatial thing, that can be down to existing conditions, in this case the heights of the ceiling. And yeah, so we get to a kind of an outcome on this, I suppose, which is a public tour that I went on. And you can see some of the building materials that are set on a table. And you might even actually begin to notice some patterns there. There's various materials put together. There's planks, there's light shade, big block works, insulation, pipe work. There's various materials from the archive, and it's surely just rubbish, right? It's just junk or objects that have been discarded, mundane. There's nothing particularly interesting about them, some people would argue. And this is also kind of the view on the day of the public tour. When I went round with it, there was a really curious moment where you see it there on the left-hand side, people were stood over, and there was a kind of silence and an uncertainty of what it was exactly they were looking at. You know, they could see materials and they could see that maybe it had been organized in a particular way. And then the tour guide, who's also the archivist and curator in the middle with the paper there, began to explain to them and said, this is an artwork. And there's a collective sigh and a change and a realization that they're looking at something important, that there's more to this. This has been curated in a particular way. And then everyone's phones came out and everyone wants to take photos, because now people understand and kind of digest this as something special, as something of value. I spoke to the artist who curated this particular artwork, and he said there was still a number of people who kind of didn't really necessarily agree that this is an artwork. But this is the really interesting point to prise open. This is the kind of exhibition as an arena, a political arena of different views and different viewpoints. And it begins to allow us to see that objects aren't necessarily stable. And this isn't just an object like a small piece of building material here, but this is what you've been looking at as well through your research and this idea of the city. It's not necessarily a stable thing. It's contested. It's open to various persuasions, various contingencies related to politics, economics, whose voices stand. And in this case, we have a artwork which mediates different views on the value of these building materials. Can they really be something artistic? And it, speaking to the main curator, the response to this was incredible. A number of people, local people, in the weeks and months that followed, would get in touch. They would bring to the fore their own building materials from their house and say, "Is this interesting? Is this worthy of collecting?" So in some ways, an appreciation for these materials and for the Bauhaus, it achieved some kind of goal in becoming public, and kind of sort of cementing, if you like, starting to solidify the value of the Bauhaus as something that's not just kind of contained within the walls of the institution, but bleeds out into the local, the sort of local city and the local area. And since that exhibition, there's even been a number of people call the Bauhaus and inquire about, if I were to purchase a home in the Turton settlement, do you think I could restore it? I think it could be an interesting bed and breakfast, a place for people to come and reside. So you can start to see through from the very beginning to where we get now a kind of circular economy, if you like, or also the way in which these objects begin to affect their value starts to become registered and recognized among a group of people. So that's just this point here, that there's a growing interest and a renewed understanding of old and unwanted rubble. So the appreciation of the value of these mundane architectural objects is growing. A number of people contacting the archive with their own building materials, which are made locally around the same time. Now, this brings up all sorts of other interesting points around, they've for the last 15 years been relying on the goodwill of people, but they now think maybe we need to bring in contracts because some people are asking for money. So there's a really interesting point there. And again, I touch upon the reading you read today about this kind of informality of urban spaces. There's a point within that in which kind of informal practices might eventually become something more formal. They might become regimented. They might become a part of kind of existing political systems where they don't necessarily start that way. And we're starting to see that process here where they're worried that people might come from 10 years ago and say, "Hey, I donated that to you, but I want it back because I think it's worth something." So you can start to see the way this kind of this network, if you like, of Bauhaus architectural heritage value begins to sort of cement itself. It becomes real, and then it starts to also have political consequences. So in conclusion, in the regime of heritage discourse, my ethnographic work shows that buildings we valorize, that is, buildings we believe to be valuable, that we make valuable, and to believe to be inherently valuable, are actually made valuable by a series of events and new relations. Those events are the processes of collecting, of archiving and exhibiting in my case. The case of the staircase showed us that some people do not necessarily consider architectural objects to be of heritage value. Rather, they operate in a different mode of existence as something purely technical. When its use is gone, it is no longer wanted and it's thrown out. This is where the opportunity for new life in the form of heritage value takes shape, through the many movements, the transactions and reassemblies which take place. It shows us that a monument or building of the past are not especially frozen in time or simply windows into the past. That's not where their value comes from. Their value is precisely because of their active presence today, their ability to make us collect and archive, and their ability to generate potential new futures and different histories in the present. And so, what I'll say from that is that there's been in the last year a lot of publicity around the exhibiting of these materials, which has resulted in them loaning out radiators to an exhibition in Poland and bricks to an exhibition in Zurich. So this kind of heritage, if you like, this value comes from this very present moment, this idea that we can generate new possibilities and create new connections. So thank you very much. I'm open to very many questions, any clarity. If anyone feels that it's somehow, might even relate to their own thesis, I'd be open and interested to hearing your views. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon, for the lecture. Can I ask you a question myself? Are you able to hear me all right?
I can't hear you there, Lucy. Oh, wait, sorry. Can you? Are you there? Yeah, sorry, I muted my laptop because it was buzzing halfway through.
Thanks for the lecture. I'd just like to ask a question myself.
Yeah, sure.
I think that it would be really interesting to see the trajectory, particularly from the students' perspective and the stage they're at now. It'd be really interesting to know if there was any connection between your master's studies yourself in the MArch and the dissertation that you did as part of that, and what it's led on to you developing in your research now.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a connection. Mine was actually in my theoretical framework and the kind of readings that I was interested in at master's level, which was, we've even touched upon a few of the readings, Bruno Latour and the kind of readings related to actor network theory. In my master's thesis, I actually looked at some of the ideas from Latour, especially this kind of nature culture, this relationship, which has been a theme that's emerged a lot in urbanism, the relationship between the natural world, if you like, being on one side, and on the other side, the urban world, the society side. And I was really interested in these ideas, and I drew on Le Corbusier as a kind of point for analysis, and found within a lot of kind of postmodern literature, especially, they were bringing to the fore the kind of contradictions in sort of the ideas of early modernism, which again is something I think we've been touching on, this idea that you can reach a unified final goal and you can kind of overcome all the problems of the past through these kind of designs, and if only people work to these kind of conditions and live in this way, all these kind of prescriptions that were brought forward in early modernist ideas. I found it really interesting and a point to start to explore and understand. And yeah, I suppose from there, I was interested in the Latourian text, in understanding that there is a relationship here in the way we sort of understand and assume the world and our relationship to it, and what a kind of urban looks like and what rural looks like. But in my case, it was more to do with these various contradictions seem to be related to the way it was historicized. So they would often in modern tech and in postmodern texts, and even like Kenneth Frampton and Carl Jenks and others talk about the various the ways in which his work didn't fulfill its outcomes, it didn't fulfill its potential. And then, yeah, from there, I found out that this was more to do with the fact that we have assumptions about kind of linearity in the passage of time. and we kind of historicize that in a particular way as well. But yeah, from there, I sort of moved into modern heritage in my first year, and I was going to go to the Le Corbusier Foundation. But instead, I got that opportunity in the Bauhaus lab, and things change when you have opportunities, when suddenly something comes forward, or you might email a particular person and they're interested in sharing with you, whereas 5 other people might close you down or not be interested. And I would say, to people, it's really important that you kind of hold on to those who seem to be willing to give you the time, because from there you can get leads, and I suppose it developed on and on from there. But tentatively, there was a very light link between the kind of readings and this kind of critique on modernity or the ideas of modernism.
Thanks, Simon. That's a helpful tip there as well, to value the people you reach out to that are keen to engage and contribute their time and their energy.
Yeah.
It's always a risk, actually, isn't it, when you involve other people in your research, that you are then quite reliant on them. So when people are really cooperative and helpful, it's not just intellectually interesting, but terribly vital to completing your research.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, a lot of people in whichever kind of avenues you'd be interested in exploring, there's a lot of people out there who really have a lot to say about their work, because it's part of their life, and they're there's people out there who are really, really happy to share that and want to share that. These interviews can become places where they want to put the world to right, and they want to tell you how they think things should be, and problems within kind of perhaps the way things are. And when these people come forward, it's really important to keep them close, I suppose. Oh, David's got his hand up.
Yeah, just Simon, just one question of clarification. The artist, the selection of objects. What was the criteria for the selection of the objects again?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and again, this is kind of related to, as I said, when you go into the archive, the objects are organized in a particular way. The same way when they're kind of in situ in a building, they're organized in a particular way, often hidden. And then when you get to the artwork, they're organized in a particular way. And for him, I had a really interesting interview on his experience in the archive. And he very much almost plays the role of the artist, in which he's American first and foremost, so he doesn't speak, he speaks very broken German. So he wasn't necessarily able to read the labels associated to each object. So, there was a kind of alienation in the existing category systems. And instead, he talked about the materials based on their size, on their color, on their shape. Certain objects, in his words, screamed out to me, whereas others didn't. And, I would say that in the creation of this artistic value, that kind of narrative that's associated with the artist is integral. Their work, if you like, is being kind of interpolated into these objects. It's becoming a part of, and it becomes a part of the new existence of these objects. And no longer are they kind of valuable through their ordinary functioning as mundane, ordinary, often invisible kind of functional objects. Instead, they become a part of this narrativization of our respect to materiality and the history of the Bauhaus, but also his kind of artistic persuasion on that. The Sorio talks about the spirit of the artist, you know, in the making of an object. So yeah, it was kind of a new set of relations, a new regime based on kind of something rather abstract, materiality, shape, size.
And then the objects, they just go back into the archive once
Yeah,
the
it's
exhibition is completed.
Yeah, it's 5 years, this exhibition.
5
And
years.
yeah, they will go back into the archive. Yeah, so it's almost like, yeah, this moment in time as well, in which they are associated with an artist, and they're able, you know, that transmits as well. That's a really important part of this exhibition. It's a public service. It's a place where people can potentially learn about, but not necessarily, you know, as a kind of didactic tool, but a means, a kind of, you could argue, a political arena in which people can come along and even question and say, what? No, I don't agree with this, or I disagree. Or I do, you know, I understand and take interest. And so it's a space in which, you know, these objects are allowed to speak for themselves, almost exploded or isolated from their usual functions, their usual performing functions. And that kind of engenders this new kind of understanding, which is, for me at least, very much associated to the generation of a heritage value.
But the artist just selects them just because he's interested in it, or he likes it, or
Yeah, he spent 4 days there, and yeah, he made a number of various iterations, like I think 4 in total, which went to a board, including a director and the head of the research archive and the head of the construction department. And he sat there and he said, okay, these are my ideas. And they liked this, they liked that one to develop the most. But it was certainly, for him at least, he'd never been to the archive before. And he was kind of, yeah, a new experience, and he's going into kind of existing system of categorization in a way, just kind of manipulating / playing with that idea of reassembling these objects into something which kind of transmits a new kind of value. And yeah, I just think there's an important point within that for everyone to think about, which is just this this idea of objects as mediators. And I've heard various examples from people in my class over the weeks. We've had the Mancunian Highway, we've had Stuttgart 21 Railway. And I think basically this really important point, which is one that's been coming up in the readings as well, is that objects aren't necessarily, you know, fixed. They don't have an inherent status. They are the source of potential contestation. You know, they are controversies which can be read in different ways, which can tell us about the kind of nature of a political setup and the ways in which that setup is then inscribed in the city. So it's a really interesting and I think important point for people to look at the potential changing kind of status or views or relationships that perhaps their object or subject of study has.
Could I ask another question then?
Yeah.
Yeah, just maybe just the relationship of what constitutes the Bauhaus and maybe mass production. And I was just thinking about, you know, how, you know, this, in a sense, this mining of the neighborhood of,
Yeah.
of, of objects that might have been fashioned at the time, constructed in industries that were associated with the Bauhaus. And I mean, in a sense, it's almost as though that the neighborhood is part of the Bauhaus, or is the Bauhaus as well, and then maybe I guess the question here might be, how would that contrast um, with, let's say, a UNESCO definition of what the Bauhaus is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's probably come from the fact it's been somewhere there throughout the presentation, not necessarily been explicitly made like that. But I think this relates, of course, to why I think ethnographic research is so important in perhaps unpacking and questioning these kind of high-level authoritative kind of categories of value in this case, or typical standards and descriptions. And when we go kind of down to the ground, we start to kind of see the kind of messiness of it all, and see the ways in which these neatly defined boxes, which kind of are the signpost at the top, integrity, originality, authenticity, start to break down, start to become more complicated, even as the archivist told me in the archive, an interesting mixture of things. So, to answer your question, it's more why is this kind of ethnographic research, or this study, kind of interesting, and what points does it start to bring to light? For me, it starts to question existing notions of, for example, originality, existing ideas that the Bauhaus is somehow kind of an isolated, an authentic kind of heritage object. Rather, when we go down to the ground, when we go into the archive and we see the mundane objects, these objects which are typically invisible, yet in fact constitute the Bauhaus in entirety, we find ordinariness everywhere. It's such ordinariness that these objects are often found in regular homes, and regular buildings around the same time, because they relied on local industry. They relied on, there was a local radiator mass manufacturer in the city. There was a window manufacturer. They got their clay about 15 kilometers away. When you strip back the Bauhaus, in fact, a lot of it's made of clay brick and not concrete. So then the question becomes, rather that these objects are not necessarily have this kind of embodied or inherent value in the way kind of early discussions around restoration, such as Viollet-le-Duc and his name slipped my mind now, arts and crafts man, John Ruskin. This idea that these objects are authentic, and tied to that authenticity is these kind of like original materials, which is related to the technique of its maker. Instead, we see in fact that the Bauhaus is a kind of seemingly original, quasi-original object, which is made up of lots of benign and ordinary parts which don't really have a defined boundary. That's sort of evident in the fact they collect various mundane objects from other local homes. But yeah, it starts to bring to light, in fact, that the Bauhaus as an object, it has to be worked towards, it has to be maintained. That kind of idea of its originality and its authenticity, which exists, of course, at a kind of legal and institutional UNESCO state level, but also on the ground through these kind of muddied, uncharted practices where they're not even, part of their job description. They're just out there collecting things from locals, from friends, from neighbours, telephone calls from city planners, and just bringing kind of an ensemble of bits together, which ultimately help in the restoration and conservation work, because that's why this archive is so important. A building like the Bauhaus can't be left to go to ruin, because it's a modern institution and it's a modern building. It requires regular upkeep, it requires painting regularly, the prevention of weathering. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of continued practice. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that was great.
Thanks everyone for questions, and Simon, of course, for your lecture as well. I think we'd better leave it there since it's got so late. But well done everyone for another very productive, very busy day with lots and lots of food for thought. And we will have the same sort of setup again next Tuesday.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.